My name is Ethan. I am 35 years old and work as an engineer. Until recently, I lived together with my girlfriend Sarah, also 35. I'm not going to give any detailed description of where we live or what it looks like around us because I feel it's not that relevant. The only thing that feels relevant is what happened between me and Sarah and how I ended up in a situation where my self-confidence was completely crushed. I thought I would share the whole story in one go because maybe it can help someone else who's going through something similar. I met Sarah about 4 years ago. We were then working in different departments at the same company. She was known for being quick, efficient, and quite ambitious. I had heard her name mentioned in the break room a few times, but I had no idea what she was like as a person. I still remember the first time I saw her. It was at an internal workshop on how to drive product development more agilely. Again, I'm not going to go into what room we were in or which presentation slides we looked at because it doesn't matter now. The point is that Sarah took the floor and explained a solution to a problem with such confidence that I was completely impressed. I remember thinking right then and there what it would be like to work closely with a person like that. A few weeks later, I got the chance to talk to her in more depth because we ended up in the same project group. I was immediately fascinated by her attitude toward life. She was very results-oriented, very skilled, and very determined. At the same time, there was a warmth when she talked about her private interests. It was like she could shift from professional and sharp project leader to a more relaxed person, at least for a couple of minutes at a time. That contrast attracted me. We started taking joint lunches and talking more outside of work. I quickly realized we had a lot in common, especially our interest in technology and problem solving. It didn't take long before I asked her if we could meet for dinner. She said yes. We clicked in a way I had never experienced before. She was in the midst of a career climb, and I was a bit calmer, but we had fun together. It felt like we complemented each other, where she was the driving force and I was the thoughtful one. During our first months together, it was very calm and harmonious. We kept it secret at work for a while because we didn't know how people would react when they realized that two people on the same project had fallen in love. But it seemed like nobody really cared. At work, we went about our business, and privately, we spent time together constantly. First a bit tentatively, then she more or less stayed with me, or vice versa, and we eventually decided to officially move in together when we had been together for almost a year. Already during the first year, I sometimes noticed small things in the way she expressed herself. She could tease me about how I arranged groceries in the fridge or how I booked laundry times. Nothing gross, more like little jabs. Is that really how you do it, Bess? Or do you always do it like this? It wasn't exactly mean, but it sometimes felt like she saw me as a bit clumsy. I thought it was because she was extremely organized and wanted things in order, while I'm a bit more flexible. I let it roll off my back because I thought every relationship has that kind of thing. Plus, I enjoyed being with her so much that I hardly gave it much weight. Our first really serious discussion came after just over a year together. I had promised to cook one evening, but I was late from work and came home with somewhat hastily purchased ingredients. I tried to throw together a pasta dish, but it didn't turn out great. According to me, it tasted okay, but nothing special. Then came the first comment that really stung me. You know, my ex-boyfriend always made sure to use fresh herbs and make the sauce from scratch. That's how you really should do it. That comment might not have been super mean, but the tone was a blend of condescending and mocking. I tried to laugh it off, but at the same time I felt belittled. I didn't know she had had such a passionate relationship with an ex-boyfriend who could cook so well. I thought maybe it was just a spontaneous comparison, but it still hurt. Days went by, and I noticed that Sarah sometimes continued to comment on small things and refer to her ex-boyfriend. She often mentioned that he could be very spontaneous and fun. If I tried something spontaneous, she might sometimes say, "That's almost like my ex-boyfriend used to do, but he did it differently." It was never any long descriptions, but I felt she wanted to point out that she had been with someone else before who did things better, or at least differently in a more efficient way. Even then, I started to wonder why she needed to bring up that person, when it was me she had chosen to be with. I never really asked her outright, but carried the question within me. After about 2 years in the relationship, it went from occasional jabs now and then to more systematic arrows aimed at my self-confidence. She might say, "What if you were more like a certain person I used to know?" without mentioning the ex by name explicitly, but I understood it was him she was talking about. She made me understand that this ex-boyfriend was better at being spontaneous, fun, and driven. I began to feel a gnawing worry inside, but I was still in love. I didn't want to break up or cause a fight. I thought, maybe she's right that I should be more driven, more spontaneous. Instead of confronting it, I thought about how I could strengthen my sense of self-worth. I thought I could work harder at work and take more responsibility and maybe impress her that way. But even when I tried, other forms of criticism arose. She might comment that I missed deadlines and that I reminded her of people who never got things done on time. I didn't quite know how to act to please her. If I was more ambitious, I felt she saw it as me not being as good as her ex. If I was more relaxed, that was also wrong. It was like walking on invisible eggshells. What really wore me down was the way she mentioned her ex. Sometimes it felt like she was talking about some kind of superhuman who could do everything better than me. At the same time, I felt confused because she always implied that the relationship with him had been turbulent and difficult. So how could he still appear to be such a star? I began to suspect that maybe she was exaggerating, but I had nothing concrete to go on. Over time, the jabs escalated even more. Sometimes she came up with comments like, "Imagine if you understood how passion really works," or "Imagine if you were a bit more adventurous like he was." I carefully asked her why she still thought about her ex. She replied something along the lines of, "I don't want to think about him, but you remind me sometimes. I want you to be better." The words, "I want you to be better," stuck with me. It almost sounded like she saw me as some kind of project. I no longer felt like an equal partner, but like a small child who needed to be told how to do things right. The hardest blow came when she started to take jabs at me more intimately. In bed, she might say things like, "Maybe you need a little inspiration. My ex-boyfriend could always surprise me." I tried to have an honest conversation about how hurtful this was, but she dismissed it by saying I was too sensitive. She claimed that she was just trying to help me improve. Later, on another occasion, when things had been tense for a while, she might say, "Sometimes I miss that feeling of how one could be spontaneous. It's something I had with him, but not with you." I felt utterly crushed. It didn't matter what I did. I tried to surprise her, suggested new things, booked all sorts of activities, but nothing was good enough. She constantly compared me to this man I didn't even know much about. At one particular point, she completely crossed the line. We were in bed and she made a comment that her ex was well endowed and knew what he was doing. It was as if she wanted to stomp on my masculinity. I couldn't even respond. I was so stunned that she could say something so hurtful. I felt completely worthless in comparison. It got to the point where I began to avoid intimacy because I didn't want to risk more stinging comments. I felt that every time we were in an intimate situation, she could mention her ex in a way that made me feel inadequate. I even started to wonder if she had feelings for him or missed him. But she always said she loved me and didn't want him back. "I just want you to grow and get better," she sometimes explained, as if I were some sort of project in her eyes. Eventually, I began to seriously consider leaving the relationship. I loved her, or at least the image I had of her when we started our relationship, but I no longer saw the same person. I talked to a few close friends, but I never gave them all the details because I felt ashamed. What if people judged me for being so weak? At the same time, my self-esteem plummeted. Was I really that bad at everything? Was I a lousy engineer? Was I a boring person? Was I even subpar in bed? My work performance suffered, and I started doubting whether I belonged in this industry at all. These were new thoughts for me. I had always enjoyed my job, but now it felt like I was totally useless, both privately and professionally. One evening, I was sitting at home alone because Sarah was working late. I became curious about who this ex-boyfriend was. Not because I wanted to snoop, but more because I needed to understand how she could have such a perception of him. I had noticed an old photo in her phone once when she accidentally unlocked the screen while we were having dinner, and I saw two people in the picture. I assumed it was her and the ex, but I didn't ask anything. This evening, I decided to look through her old Facebook posts, the ones that were public, hoping to maybe see a tag or some reference. I wanted to know his name. After some searching, I found his name, Aaron Reed. I didn't recognize him, but I saw that she had previously commented on his posts many years ago. Out of sheer desperation, I looked him up to see if his profile was public or not. It turned out you could see quite a bit on his profile. It showed that he was unemployed. There were pictures of him socializing with friends, but also posts where he asked for financial help in different ways. He clearly wasn't a successful person. I saw nothing indicating that he had been a whiz at cooking, or that he had a flourishing career or anything like that. Nor did I see any evidence that he had been particularly adventurous. In one of his public posts, he wrote that he needed a job and that he had never gotten the chance to pursue further education. All of this completely contradicted the image Sarah had painted. It was rather the opposite. He seemed quite lost, at least based on the posts he himself had written. I was shocked but also relieved. At least it was clear that her super ex didn't seem to be the star she had implied. Naturally, I didn't know if she was completely making things up, but I suspected she had greatly exaggerated. The question was just, why? And how was I going to bring this up with her? I decided not to confront her right away, but I wanted to think through how I would say it. But the frustration inside me grew. She had put me down by comparing me to someone who, judging by his own posts, was not successful at all. Why play that game at all? In the end, I couldn't hold back. One evening when we were home, I said outright, "I know who your ex-boyfriend is. I've seen his profile, and he doesn't seem at all like the success story you've painted." Sarah first looked like she didn't understand what I was talking about, but I showed her some of the posts I had seen, that he was unemployed and complained about his finances. I didn't want to be accusatory, but I must admit I sounded pretty upset. She stood silent for a while, and I remember feeling a strange mix of anger and relief. I waited for her explanation. Her response was that she wanted to give me a bit of a competitive spirit and shape me up. She claimed she thought I would be motivated by hearing that someone else did things better. She also said that sometimes she missed the spontaneity in our relationship and that she used her ex-boyfriend as an example, not because he was a fantastic person, but because she knew it would push me. I stood there speechless. I couldn't understand how she didn't realize how incredibly manipulative and hurtful it had been. I asked her if she herself actually believed in her portrayal. She answered that she had just exaggerated a bit. I felt that she didn't really grasp the depth of how hurt I was or care about it. I said I wanted her to stop taking jabs at me and stop comparing me with some ex-boyfriend. I asked her to explain how she could say such harsh things in bed. For me, it was one of the most humiliating experiences I've had. She mostly shrugged and said she hadn't thought about the consequences, that she thought I would understand it was a joke or that I would use it as fuel to get better. I began to realize that this had gone too far. I couldn't gloss over it or excuse her anymore. My entire being was worn down by her jabs, and there she stood, not even seeming to understand why I was broken inside. That's when I made the decision. I said I had to leave the relationship. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt that the trust and respect were gone. She stood there in front of me trying to negotiate. "I can stop, I promise. I didn't know you took it so hard." But it was already too late. My self-esteem had taken such a beating, and I couldn't just forget everything. I loved her, or at least the person I thought she was, but now I saw someone else. Someone who had deliberately used me as some sort of project and used a fabricated, glorified ex-boyfriend as a method to put me down. It was too much. I needed to save myself. It was me or the relationship, and for the first time in a long time, I chose myself. Of course she was upset. She tried to persuade me to give her a chance to prove she could change. Over the following days, she sent countless text messages and tried to call me. She suggested couples therapy, and I know she called a colleague of mine to ask if I was okay, but I felt that a line had been crossed. I moved out within a week. It was practically difficult since we both were on the lease, but I preferred to take some losses just to get out quickly. My own security was more important. It felt indescribably heavy to leave everything we had built, but at the same time a relief once I actually walked out the door. Afterwards, she sometimes sent me emails saying she missed me and that she now understood how bad her behavior had been. She wrote that she realized how she had manipulated me. Somewhere in those messages, she also accused me of not being ready to commit fully to the relationship. But I responded that it wasn't about my lack of commitment, but about the fact that she, by constantly comparing me to her ex, had broken me down. I haven't heard from her in a while now, and I prefer it that way. I've finally started to rebuild myself again. It's been a long process. I never thought that an otherwise successful adult person like me would end up in such a situation. When you hear about toxic relationships, you often think of worse situations involving physical violence or extreme mental torment. But this was like a slow poisoning. Those little jabs, the comparisons, the sneers, they dug into me step by step. They undermined my entire self-esteem until I barely recognized myself. Now, looking back on it all, I wonder how I could have stayed so long. But I was in love, and that often blinds you. I hoped until the very end that she would see me for who I am, without constantly thinking about a fictitiously perfect ex-boyfriend. I remember the Ethan I was before I met Sarah. I was calm, maybe a little shy in social settings, but still stable and secure in myself. Over the past few years, I became nervous and anxious, afraid that I was doing something wrong, and that she would start teasing me. I avoided certain topics and certain activities to avoid hearing, "My ex-boyfriend used to." It's incredible how long one can walk on tiptoe, thinking you have to be perfect to be acceptable. In hindsight, I realized that if someone truly loves you, you don't need to live up to a bunch of strange demands. Sure, relationships require compromise, but not to the extent that you constantly feel unworthy. I decided to write all this in a long post to highlight how dangerous it can be when a partner constantly compares you to someone else, especially when it's an ex-partner, a person who might be surrounded by myths and fantasies. It's so easy to be convinced that you need to try harder, that you're not good enough, that the ex was better. It's one thing if the comparisons happen in isolated situations and in a joking way that both parties can appreciate. But if it happens repeatedly and in a condescending way, it can really destroy your self-esteem. I'm not without fault either. I should have communicated more clearly from the start how much it hurt. But I took the quiet route and tried to avoid conflict. In the end, the situation became untenable. I also want to emphasize that I don't hate Sarah. I don't think she was a demon who enjoyed hurting me. Maybe she was so caught up in her ambition, her perception of success, and her own fear of settling that she drove herself to push me. She had said that she liked feeling powerful and enjoyed pushing me to accomplish great things. It speaks to a very skewed notion of what a healthy relationship should be. I think some people believe that negative criticism and comparisons will function as a spur, when in reality it only breaks you down. When I moved out, I initially felt devastated, as if I were throwing away 4 years of my life. It took a while to realize it wasn't wasted. I learned something incredibly important about my own boundaries, about how I don't want to be treated. I also learned a lot about my own vulnerability and that I can fall pretty hard if I'm mentally manipulated. I want to believe that I'll use this experience in future relationships to set clearer boundaries, be more open about how I feel, and never allow anyone to trample on my dignity the way she did. Returning to work was also a process. I had withdrawn and not performed well at the end. Some colleagues noticed I wasn't myself. Once I was free from Sarah's constant jabs, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I started performing better again and found some of the joy in the job that I had lost. It was no easy journey, but it was liberating to gradually regain my self-esteem. My friends also noticed a difference. I felt freer to be myself, without fear that someone would comment on every little mistake I made and use it against me. I mentioned early in the post that I only recently dared to write about this. Maybe it's because on some level I was ashamed of being in such a relationship. I want people to know that even if you're an adult, successful individual in many ways, you can end up in a destructive relationship. It's not about being weak or stupid. It often happens because you are gradually led into a reality where you're constantly criticized in subtle ways until it becomes normalized. For me, it took almost 4 years to realize that this wasn't normal and not healthy. Only when I saw proof of the ex-boyfriend's real situation could I fully comprehend how deeply manipulated I had been. Now that I'm sitting here writing this post, I don't feel 100% recovered. I still have moments where I'm afraid I'm not good enough. I can still hear Sarah's voice in my head sometimes, but I've learned to deal with it. I will probably always be the calmer type, but I no longer think there's anything wrong with that, and I don't need to be super extroverted or spontaneous in exactly the way she wanted. I don't have to measure myself against another person she idealized or fabricated. It's enough that I am who I am. I want to remind all readers who are struggling with similar situations that a partner should support, not undermine. A partner should be able to provide constructive criticism, sure, but not constantly demean you in a way that makes you feel worthless. I know she tried contacting me after I moved out. I also know she tried to get me to change my mind by saying she would change herself and stop the jabs. But for me, the trust was gone. It wasn't just one comment, it was a pattern that went on for years where I sometimes felt like a second-class human being, constantly compared to a phantom ex. It showed a fundamental lack of respect for me. And no matter how much she claims to regret it, I can't go back there and act like everything is forgotten. I don't have the energy to sacrifice more of my self-esteem to that kind of dynamic. So I've decided to move on with my life. I share this to give others insight into how subtle, recurring jabs can damage a relationship. In the beginning, I saw it as a small warning sign, but I ignored it. Maybe I needed validation back then and was willing to put up with a bit of everything. But I would advise anyone who feels their partner is constantly comparing them to someone else to stand up for themselves. Address it directly and clearly, and if your partner doesn't listen or continues, think long and hard about whether the relationship is really worth saving. For my part, I wish I had spoken up the first time she hinted that my ex-boyfriend used to do this better. Maybe we could have had an honest conversation, or I might have realized much earlier that this wasn't right for me. Now that I'm returning to single life, I feel a strange mix of relief and sadness. I mourn the image I had of Sarah and how it could have been if she had been different. But I'm also relieved not to wake up day after day feeling inadequate. I can be myself without worrying about how she judges my actions compared to another man. When I think of Aaron Reed, the so-called ex-boyfriend, I can't help but feel sorry for him too. He seemed to be having a tough time and was hardly the type of person I had imagined as super successful. On some level, it's tragic that Sarah used him as a projection of perfection when he himself apparently had a hard life. It just shows how fantastical the whole thing was. And for those of you wondering, I haven't planned to try to fix the relationship or even maintain a friendly contact with Sarah. She and I do still work at the same large company, but in different departments, and we rarely see each other. When we do, we only exchange short greetings, if that, and then move on. I don't have anger in my eyes when I see her, mostly just a tired feeling that that's over now. I don't want to fight or brood. I just want to find my way back to myself and let her deal with her own demons.
If you liked this story, please subscribe and give us a thumbs up. It helps a lot, and you won't miss out on any future stories. Take care and live your best life.